The abduction of 6-year-old little Emily, missing for 10 years, and her reunion with her family. Emily's disappearance was a mystery that puzzled everyone for a decade. One moment she was playing in the park with her parents, Rick and Sarah, and the next she was gone without a trace. It was a heart-wrenching moment for the family. They never gave up hope that one day she would return. Little did they know that their prayers were about to be answered in the most unexpected way. 10 years later, as Rick and Sarah were settling down for the night, they heard a knock at the door. To their shock and delight, there stood Emily, looking as if no time had passed at all. Sarah couldn't believe her eyes, and nearly fainted at the sight of her daughter. Emily's words were haunting. "Mom, I need to tell you something." This mysterious reunion was sure to bring new challenges and questions to the family, but they were ready to face them head on and ready to find out. Emily's return to her childhood home was filled with emotion and surprise. Her mother, Sarah, couldn't believe her eyes as she stared at her daughter. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she tried to process the fact that her daughter, whom she hadn't seen in over a decade, was finally standing in front of her. The years had passed and Emily had grown into a young woman, but her mother recognized her immediately. With a smile on her face, Emily stepped forward and declared, "Yes, Mom, it's me. I'm home." The reunion between mother and daughter was a moment filled with tears, joy, and a deep sense of longing that had finally been fulfilled. Sarah was overcome with emotion as she hugged Emily tightly, tears streaming down her face. Her husband rushed over in disbelief, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. "But how?" he asked, his voice shaking. Sarah and her husband were both in shock, trying to make sense of the impossible. Emily simply stood there, taking it all in. She had waited for this moment for a decade, and now finally she was home. "I'm home," she whispered, her voice filled with a sense of peace and contentment. The reunion was a moment of pure joy and happiness, leaving Sarah and her husband with a deep sense of gratitude and a story that would stay with them forever. She had faced numerous challenges, but her determination to reunite with her parents had never wavered. The past years had been a roller coaster of emotion and hardship, but she refused to let go of the hope that she would one day see her loved ones again. Her parents were her source of strength, and the thought of them kept her going even through the darkest moments. But now, after overcoming seemingly insurmountable obstacles, she was finally back in the safety of her family's arms. She was filled with a sense of relief and accomplishment, and was ready to share her story with the world. With a deep breath, she began to recount the events that had led her to this moment. What had she endured to make it here? It all started that day 10 years ago when her parents took Emily to the park. It was early in the afternoon, and Rick and Sarah took their daughter outside. There was a park near their house. They visited often, so they let Emily roam freely as they sat on the bench and watched her. Emily played on the slide and around the monkey bars and was in sight the whole time. But her parents made one tiny mistake. They had been to this park so often that they trusted nothing bad would happen. So for a moment they took their eyes off their daughter. They lost sight of their daughter as they laughed and talked with their neighbor. It was a brief conversation, no longer than 2 minutes, but it was enough. Rick looked back at the playground and Emily was gone. His mind filled with panic as he shot up and ran circles around the playground, shouting his daughter's name. Rick and Sarah spent the next few minutes in total panic. The neighbors searched the surroundings with them, but Emily was nowhere to be found. Sarah knew she had to be taken by someone, so they immediately called the police. Meanwhile, Emily was in a situation she wouldn't be able to get away from for the next 10 years. Emily could hear her parents shout for her to come back, but she was unable to answer. The person who took her held his hand over her mouth as he carried her to the back of his van. She tried to bite him, but his gloves were too thick. He opened the sliding door and threw her in. The man sped away, even drove past Emily's parents, but they were in too much of a panic to notice. Emily banged her little fist on the van's back window and yelled as hard as she could, but no one could hear her. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she watched her parents become little dots in the distance. Ever since that moment, she had been in survival mode. The kidnapper drove for what seemed like eternity, and when he finally stopped, it was already getting darker outside. The man got out of the van and left Emily inside for a few minutes. She looked through the back window to see if she could recognize anything, but it was in vain. Emily noticed two people standing across the street. She started yelling, hoping they would hear her, but they didn't even flinch. Suddenly, the van door flew open and the kidnapper rushed in. He immediately started the car and sped off. "Quiet!" he yelled at her. Emily knew it was over. After what felt like an eternity on the road, they finally reached their destination. As the man opened the van door, Emily was jolted out of her daze. With a rough tug on her arm, she was pulled into the darkness. The only thing that surrounded her was an eerie forest, shrouded in complete darkness. Emily's heart raced as she gazed around, unsure of what was to come next. The man's grip on her arm was tight, and she could sense the fear in the air. What kind of place was this? What was going to happen to her? Emily couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in the pit of her stomach. She braced herself for the unknown as the man dragged her further into the dark forest. They entered a little wooden cabin. It reeked of spoiled food. There were many empty pizza boxes inside. The man opened a hatch in the ground that led to an underground cellar. He threw Emily down the stairs and closed the hatch again. Leaving her alone, Emily felt devastated, but it wasn't over yet. Emily looked around her as her vision adjusted to the darkness. She could make out a thin little mattress on the ground and a bucket in the corner of the room. She was little enough to stand up, so she shuffled around the walls to feel if there were any windows, but there weren't. Emily felt the stairs and climbed up them until she reached the hatch. She tried to push it open, but it was locked from the other side. She banged against it with her fist, but got startled as the kidnapper stomped on the hatch. As a reaction, "Shut up!" he yelled at her. "Let me out!" she yelled back. The kidnapper kept her in the basement for what felt like a month. There were no windows, so it was dark 24/7. This made her lose track of time. He only opened the hatch to throw food down at her so she could eat or to give her a bowl of water. Emily was taken aback as the hatch to her confined space slowly creaked open. As she hesitantly made her way to the staircase, she couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and excitement. Her clothes were a mess, stained with dirt and soaked in sweat, but she was determined to find out what was on the other side. She trudged up the stairs, her heart racing with anticipation. When she finally reached the top, she was momentarily blinded by the bright light, but she pushed forward, eager to discover what was waiting for her. This was a defining moment for Emily, and she was determined to make the most of it. As she entered the bathroom, Emily couldn't help but feel confused by the man's behavior. "What is your name, little girl?" he asked, with a smirk on his face. Emily, still in shock, quietly replied, "Emily." The man then announced that it was time to clean her up, and pointed to the bathtub. With no other choice, Emily followed him and cautiously approached the bathtub. The man's strange behavior left Emily wondering what would happen next. Would she be able to escape, or would she be stuck with this man forever? The uncertainty of her future filled her with fear and left her feeling vulnerable and exposed. The man told her to get undressed and take a quick bath, but to Emily's surprise, he left the room and locked it behind him. Emily immediately went into full escape mode and looked around her. There was a small window, but it was too high for her to reach, and sadly, there weren't any sharp objects. She didn't want to upset the man, so she undressed and bathed herself. She washed her hair and started to feel a little normal again. Maybe this man wasn't so bad after all, but that was exactly what he wanted her little naive mind to think. Emily got out of the bath and put on the clean pajamas he had left for her. "I'm done," she said, with a shaky voice. She heard a few clicks as the lock opened, and looked as the door slowly opened. "Oh, you found the pajamas I left for you. Do you like them?" he asked. "Yes, thank you." The kidnapper's face lit up as he heard those words, but he wasn't as nice as he seemed. In the first few years of Emily's captivity, she thought the man to be nicer than she thought, but as Emily got older, she saw right through his schemes. He made sure Emily wasn't always clean and dressed in doll-like white dresses. She had to obey him and do as he asked. She lived in fear, constantly walking on eggshells around him. He was abusive and controlling, using the threat of throwing her in the basement as a way to manipulate her into doing what he wanted. The basement was her nightmare, and she was trapped there with him. The thought of it was enough to make her obey blindly, giving up her freedom for the sake of not getting hurt. As she grew older, her responsibilities only increased. Not only did she have to sleep next to him, but she was now expected to cook and clean for him too. Every day felt like a struggle, and she was desperate to escape. Emily had lived her entire life in captivity, held by a man who grew increasingly aggressive with each passing year. At the age of 16, she was about to mark a decade in captivity, and the cabin she lived in was all she knew. However, one day everything changed. Emily noticed something different, something that made her heart race and her mind race with possibilities. What could it be? Was she finally going to escape, or was it something far more sinister? Despite her fear, Emily was determined to find out what had happened and what lay ahead for her future. Emily had been trapped in that cabin for what felt like an eternity. Her captor was a cruel and sadistic man who kept her confined to the small space with no way of escape. However, one day things changed. Her captor left her alone for a few hours, a rare occurrence that made Emily's heart race with hope. She knew he would usually take away the remote to the TV, so she would have no way to pass the time. But today something was different. To her surprise, her captor had forgotten to hide the remote, and she was left with a way to entertain herself. Emily was grateful to the heavens that he had made this mistake, and she couldn't help but wonder what this could mean for her future. As Emily sat on the couch, she eagerly awaited the man's return, only to find that he had shut the door behind him. She had a sense of determination in her eyes as she reached for the remote control on the coffee table. However, as she picked it up, she realized that she was completely unfamiliar with this piece of technology. Emily had never used electronics before, and the remote seemed like a foreign object in her hands. But with a determined spirit, she began to press every button she could find. It was a bit of a struggle, but after what felt like an eternity, she finally succeeded. Emily was proud of herself, and now she couldn't wait to see what this device could do. With a press of the remote, the TV flickered to life, and she couldn't help but be captivated by the image on the screen. Her eyes widened as she tried to make sense of what was happening, completely unaware of the significance of this news channel. However, in just a few moments, she would be forever grateful for the random flick of that channel. Little did she know that the information she was about to receive would prove to be a life-saving moment. The tension built as she sat on the edge of her seat, eager to discover how this news channel would change her life forever. As Emily approached the desk, she noticed two people deep in conversation about a missing girl. Her heart ached for the unknown victim, imaging the terror and distress she must be feeling. But as she took a closer look, her mind was blown by what she saw. The two people were discussing a photo of a girl who looked all too familiar to Emily. She couldn't believe her eyes. This was not just a random missing person case. This was her sister. Emily's life changed in an instant as she realized the gravity of the situation. The mystery of her sister's disappearance now hit close to home, and she was determined to uncover the truth. A man and a woman came on the screen. They talked about the missing girl and showed a picture of her from the day she went missing. Emily's heart began to race. As she watched closely, it felt like she had a panic attack, but she did not take her eyes off the TV screen. Suddenly, she saw a picture of what the girl would look like today, and she looked just like her. Emily couldn't believe what she was seeing. She felt confused and shocked. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes when she suddenly realized what was going on. Out of nowhere, she remembered everything. This wasn't her home. She wasn't supposed to be here. She had parents who were still looking for her. All of a sudden, she remembered that she had been taken by the man at the park. She needed to escape as soon as possible. Emily turned off the TV and hid the remote. Her body was filled with adrenaline as all her old memories flooded her mind. She knew her captor could be back any minute, so she had to act fast. She wanted to get back to her parents and tell them that she was still alive, even after all these years. She inspected all the windows to see if her captor might have left some open, but to her disappointment, everything was locked. She needed to act quick here, so Emily was searching for any possibility to leave this horrific place. And just as she was about to give up, she heard an engine in the distance. Emily's heart dropped. Her captor was back, and she had no way out. She searched through the kitchen, hoping to find a weapon of some sort. They always used plastic knives, so there were no sharp objects in the kitchen drawers. By now she heard the car getting closer and closer. She frantically looked around her and finally found something. This would definitely help her in her attempt to escape this place. There, underneath the couch, she saw a metal pipe sticking out. She ran to it, grabbed it, and hid behind the door. Her heart was racing as she knew this was her only chance of ever getting out. She had to get this right the first time, or it would be game over. Emily grabbed the pipe tightly as she listened to his footsteps getting closer and closer to the door. The gravel crackled underneath his heavy boots, and she knew he could walk through the door at any minute now. Everything seemed to go in slow motion. The door handle slowly twisted, and the door opened. The man walked through the door, and before he could do anything, Emily hit him on the head with a metal pipe without any hesitation. Emily watched as the man dropped to the floor. She had no time to think. She immediately ran outside barefoot, ran for her life. She ran deep into the forest and as far as she possibly could, but she didn't know which direction to go. She just ran randomly, hoping to see other people. Every sound she heard scared her. Emily had no idea if her captor had followed her or not, so she had to be very careful. She walked and walked without really knowing where she was going. She just hoped that she would eventually come across some people which could help her. After trudging through the dense forest for several days, she stumbled upon a gas station. The sight was a bit overwhelming as she had been living in solitude in a cabin for so long. Her life had been limited to those four walls, and now she was faced with a new reality. Despite her apprehension, she gathered the courage to take a step forward. As she approached the gas station, her heart raced with excitement and fear. What adventures lay ahead? What would she discover? She hesitantly pushed open the door and was greeted by a blast of artificial light. Her heart raced with fear, but her empty stomach won over. She had been on the road for days, surviving on nothing but wild berries and rainwater. The hunger was taking its toll, and she knew she had to find something to eat. She stumbled into the gas station, her eyes adjusting to the brightness, and took a deep breath. What would she find inside? Would she finally be able to quell her hunger? She pushed on, determined to do whatever it took to survive. Emily had a feeling she was about to get grilled the moment she stepped into the room. All eyes were on her, and she could feel the weight of the scrutiny bearing down on her. She reached for a bag of chips, hoping to appear casual, but she knew that wasn't enough to deter the woman who approached her. The woman asked if everything was all right, but the expression on her face indicated that she already suspected something was amiss. Emily braced herself for what was to come. Feeling a knot from in the pit of her stomach, she had a feeling this was going to be a long conversation. Emily was taken aback by the kind-hearted woman sitting in front of her. She was at a crossroads, torn between the urge to open up and reveal everything that had been weighing on her heart and the fear of being betrayed. Despite her doubts, there was something about the woman that made Emily feel safe and secure. The pent-up emotions finally spilled over, and Emily couldn't help but break down in tears as she tried to explain her situation to the woman. Would this be the moment that changed everything for Emily, or would it lead to further heartbreak? The woman was a lifesaver for Emily, who was in dire need of help. She took her in her arms and led her to the back, where she sat her down and provided her with water and a warm blanket. Emily was in a state of shock and couldn't stop shaking, but the woman's compassion and care made her feel a little better. The woman then made a call to the police, informing them that the situation was urgent and needed their immediate help. Emily couldn't help but wonder what was going on and what fate awaited her next. Emily was filled with a mixture of emotion as she heard the sirens getting closer, the sound of rescue, the music to her ears, and she knew that her long wait was finally over. The police officers approached her with a friendly demeanor and asked for her name. Emily breathed a sigh of relief as she replied and watched as their expressions changed to recognition. It was clear that they knew who she was and they were there to bring her back to her parents. The anticipation of finally being reunited with her loved ones was almost too much to bear. Emily could feel her heart racing as the officers escorted her back home. The journey felt like an eternity, but finally she was back in the warm embrace of her parents. "Is it really you?" "Mom, I'm here," Emily whispered as she hugged her mother tightly, tears streaming down her mother's face as the reality of her daughter's return finally hit her. Emily's parents were both in a state of disbelief and had feared the worst, thinking she was gone forever. But there she was, standing before them alive and well. Her father let the police officers inside the house as the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The shock and overwhelming joy of Emily's return was unbelievable, and her parents couldn't help but hold her close and cherish every moment of her homecoming. They were overjoyed to have their daughter back, and the next chapter of their lives was about to begin. Her father let the police officers inside the house. Emily was shaken and scared. Her world had been turned upside down by a cruel and violent act. As she looked to the police officers for help, her voice trembled with emotion. She bravely asked them to arrest the man responsible for the terror she had experienced. The officers listened to her. Their expressions were filled with concern and empathy. They reassured her, promising to do everything in their power to stop the man from harming anyone else and bring him to justice. Emily felt a glimmer of hope as the officers began to work on her case. She knew she was in good hands. The next few days would be a long and trying journey, but Emily was ready to see it through. With the police on her side, she felt that justice would be served. It was a nail-biting journey for Emily, but her bravery and determination paid off. After being taken, she gathered all the information she could and shared it with the officers. Her efforts proved to be the key to solving the case. With her help, the officers were able to track down her kidnapper and bring him to justice. Emily was finally able to return to the arms of her loving parents, and from that moment on, she never looked back. The experience only made her stronger and more determined. She grew up to become a successful private detective, using her skills and knowledge to help others in need. Emily's story is a testament to the power of perseverance and the unwavering spirit of the human soul. And sadly to say, this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment. Characters and events are the products of the author's imagination. Guys, I hope you all enjoyed that story. I do apologize that it wasn't a true story, but it does give us hope. And the fact that not quite 10 years, we pray and hope that it's not 10 years down the road, but it gives us hope that maybe if a miracle happens, that Summer and many, many other children could use their own perseverance and find a way to make it back home, find a way to get help if they are being held. It's just every once in a while we need a good, heartwarming story to remind us that good things can and do happen. So, like always, guys, love your kids, call your parents, say a prayer to the good Lord that one day Summer, Moon, Utah Wells, and many, 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 many of the other children will be able to find their way home. And I'll catch you on the next video.